At a Father's Day gala inside a luxury beachfront hotel, I froze when a staff member stopped me at the entrance. Inside the ballroom, my son-in-law was raising a glass in front of more than 200 guests while announcing the sale of the last piece of land my late wife had left behind. I walked onto the stage and said, "That land doesn't belong to you." He clenched his jaw and growled, "Old man, sit down before you embarrass yourself." 1 second later, he slapped me in front of the entire room. Before we go further, if you found your way to Revenge, Dad, I am genuinely grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me what city, what country are you watching from tonight. I love knowing who's in this room with me. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is entirely real. I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. Not because I had somewhere else to be, not because I'd forgotten the date, but because as I stood at the front entrance of the Fontainebleau Hotel and watched the valet take my car, I had just learned from a 22-year-old in a white button-down, holding a tablet, that my name was not on the guest list. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hargrove," the young man said, his voice professionally smooth, the kind of smooth that comes from being trained to deliver bad news without making eye contact. "I don't see you listed under tonight's event, the Sinclair Hargrove family celebration." I stood there for a moment. The ocean breeze off Miami Beach pushed warm against my face, and the gold light from the hotel's entrance glittered across the marble steps like something out of a magazine spread. Behind me, a woman in a red gown laughed at something her husband said. Somewhere inside, a jazz quartet was playing a version of "Fly Me to the Moon" that my wife Maggie would have loved. "Could you check again?" I asked. "Edward Hargrove, the Hargrove and Sinclair Hargrove." The young man checked again. His expression didn't change, which told me everything. "I'm sorry, sir. The list was finalized by Mr. Sinclair's office this morning." My chest tightened, not from embarrassment, but from something colder, something that had been sitting at the back of my ribs for 3 years waiting to be confirmed. "Ed." I turned. George Patterson was walking toward me from the lobby, his silver hair combed back the way he'd worn it since 1987. His tuxedo slightly too wide in the shoulders, the way it always was. He was 70 years old and still moved like a man who owned the sidewalk he walked on. He reached me, shook my hand firmly, and said quietly enough that only I could hear, "I figured this might happen. Come with me." "George," I kept my voice level, "did you know I wasn't on the list?" "I suspected." He held my gaze without flinching. "That's why I texted you this afternoon, Ed. I figured if Brandon was going to pull something tonight, you deserved to be in the room when he did it." He put a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Come on, you're my guest." George Patterson had been my business partner, my oldest friend. And though most people in that building had no idea one of the original shareholders of Hargrove Capital, since the day Maggie and I incorporated it in a cramped office in Coral Gables, with a second-hand desk and a pot of bad coffee, he held 5%, had held it for 37 years without ever making a single demand. Tonight, apparently, he was going to use that standing to walk me through a door I wasn't supposed to enter. Inside, the Fontainebleau was doing what the Fontainebleau always did, performing wealth with effortless conviction. The ballroom on the 3rd floor had been taken over entirely. Crystal chandeliers, white orchids on every surface, tables dressed in ivory linen with gold-rimmed chargers that probably cost more per setting than most people's weekly grocery bill. A banner near the stage read, "A celebration of legacy, the Sinclair Hargrove family." I noticed the name order, Sinclair first. "How many people?" I asked George as we moved through the lobby crowd. 215 confirmed, he said. "Investors, business contacts, a state senator, 3 city commissioners. Brandon sent invitations 6 weeks ago." He paused. "You and I were not on that original list either." My jaw tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. The elevator opened onto the 3rd floor and the music swelled louder. We stepped into the pre-dinner cocktail hour, and the room opened up around us, beautiful buzzing, carefully curated. Waiters moved through the crowd with champagne flutes. A photographer circulated near the entrance. At the far end of the room, near the low stage where the jazz quartet played, I saw my daughter. Natalie was wearing sapphire blue, her dark hair pinned up the way she used to wear it when she was nervous about something and wanted to look composed. She was standing next to Brandon, her husband, her mistake. The man I had watched dismantle my family, one careful move at a time over 3 years, and she was laughing at something a woman in pearls had just said, Her laugh was bright and practiced and landed just slightly wrong, the way a note lands when a singer is technically correct but emotionally absent. And then she saw me. It lasted half a second. Her eyes found mine across 40 feet of ballroom, and something moved across her face, not surprise, not relief, not joy. Something closer to bracing. The kind of expression a person makes when they have been waiting for a difficult thing to arrive, and it finally has. Then she looked away. She looked away and kept smiling, and my heart broke in a way it hadn't broken since the morning I sat beside Maggie's hospital bed and watched the monitors slow down. She knew, I said quietly. It wasn't a question. George answered anyway. Yes, he said. She knew you weren't invited. I took a champagne glass from a passing waiter and didn't drink it. I stood at the edge of the room and looked at my daughter. This woman I had held as a newborn in a hospital in Coral Gables. This woman I had taught to drive in an empty parking lot in Kendall. This woman who had cried at her mother's grave and let me hold her for 20 minutes without saying a word. And I felt something I had been fighting for 3 years finally stop fighting back. I was done being patient. George, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Tell me everything you heard at the club 2 nights ago. Every word. He looked at me carefully, the look of a man deciding whether a door should be opened. Then he nodded, set his own glass down on a nearby tray and said, "Find us a corner, because what I have to tell you is going to change what tonight means." We found a corner near the west wall behind a cluster of guests who were too busy admiring each other's watches to notice 2 old men standing close together and speaking low. George wasted no time. 2 nights ago, he said, I was at Coral Gables Country Club for the Thursday dinner. I was at the bar waiting for my table. Brandon was in the booth directly behind me with a man I didn't recognize, at first mid-40s, silver at the temples, gold Rolex, the kind of tan you get from too many deals closed on boats. "And Victor Hale," I said. George's eyebrows lifted. "You know him?" "I turned down a partnership with him 4 years ago. He has a reputation for transactions that live in gray areas." My grip tightened on the champagne glass I still hadn't touched. What were they saying? Brandon was walking him through a timeline. George kept his voice just above the music. A Father's Day announcement, his words. He said he'd been building to this moment for months. He talked about presenting it in front of Senator Caldwell and the investment group as a completed decision, not a proposal. Something that looked so polished and so final that any objection would seem like disruption rather than reason. My stomach dropped 3 floors. He said the deal needed to close that night. George continued. That evening, Victor Hale was going to be in the room with the paperwork ready. Brandon said, and I'm going to quote him exactly, Ed, because I wrote it down on a napkin in the men's room. Afterward, he said, by the time the old man finds out, the ink will already be dry. The old man. I set my champagne glass down on the tray of a passing waiter before I did something with it that I couldn't take back. Which property? I asked. George looked at me the way a doctor looks at a patient right before delivering results. His eyes were steady, but something behind them was braced. Pelican Bay, he said. The southern parcel, Maggie's land. The room didn't spin. I didn't reach for the wall, but something inside me went very, very still, the way a building goes, still in the seconds between an earthquake starting and the walls beginning to crack. Maggie had loved that piece of land more than anything we owned. 12 acres on the southern edge of Fisher Island, with a private strip of beach where she planted sea grapes and morning glories, and sat with her coffee every single morning until the mornings when she couldn't get out of bed anymore. When she died, I had transferred it into the family trust specifically, so that no single decision, no single signature could ever move it without full trustee authorization. Or so I had believed. Ed, George put a hand on my arm. There's more. Tell me. Victor mentioned a number, 47 million, and he mentioned a development group out of Dallas that wants to put a boutique resort on the site. George's jaw tightened. Brandon apparently told him the family was fully aligned, that it was a unanimous decision. The heat that moved through my chest at that moment was not the sharp heat of anger. It was something slower and deeper, the particular burn of a man who has spent 3 years giving someone the benefit of the doubt and has just received his final confirmation that the doubt was entirely warranted. I looked across the room at my daughter. Natalie had moved to a table near the stage and was straightening a centerpiece, her back to me, her shoulders carrying that particular tension she'd had since she was a teenager, and something was wrong, but she'd decided not to show it. 37 years old, and she still held stress in the same place right between her shoulder blades, a tightness that crept up into her neck and made her stand just slightly too straight. She thinks she's protecting the family, I said. She thinks she's protecting her marriage, George replied. Those stopped being the same thing about 2 years ago in my estimation. He wasn't wrong. I thought about Maggie. Then not the hospital version, not the last month's, but the Maggie from 30 years ago, who used to sit across from me at the kitchen table in our first house and tell me things about people that I hadn't noticed yet. She had a gift for seeing the shape of a person's character before they showed it to you directly. She used to say that hungry people could never fully hide their hunger, that it showed up in small ways in the way they looked at things that belonged to someone else. She had said something about Brandon once. About a year into his relationship with Natalie at Christmas dinner, she had leaned over to me while the dishes were being cleared and said very quietly, "Watch his eyes when he thinks no one is looking, Ed. He's always counting." I had told myself she was protective. I had told myself all mothers looked at the men their daughters chose with a certain suspicion. I had told myself I was reading too much into a single observation made over a glass of Merlot. 2 years later, she was gone, and Brandon had begun his slow, methodical work of making himself indispensable while making everyone else, including me, including Daniel, seem difficult by comparison. "I need to ask you something," I said to George. "Ask. Did you know about this before 2 nights ago? Any part of it?" George met my eyes without a flicker of hesitation. "No. If I had, I would have called you the same night, Ed. What I heard at that bar was the first I knew of any land deal." He paused. "But I'll tell you this. I wasn't entirely surprised. A man like Brandon doesn't stop moving. He just moves where you're not looking." I straightened my jacket. My jaw was set. My hands were steady. "All right," I said. "There's something I need to tell you too, about what's already in motion." I glanced at my watch, 7:22 p.m. "And then we're going to go sit down for dinner, and we're going to act like 2 old men enjoying a party. Can you do that?" George picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray and raised it slightly. "Ed," he said, "I've been doing that my entire career." From across the room near the back wall, I noticed something I hadn't before. A woman in a navy dress standing alone near the terrace doors had just set down her champagne glass. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at her phone, and she wasn't smiling. The woman in the navy dress was still there when I looked again, standing near the terrace doors, phone in hand, face angled slightly away from the crowd. Something about the way she held herself was wrong for a party, too still, too deliberate, like she was listening to a frequency no one else in the room could pick up. But I had George in front of me, and George had more to say. "Walk me through it again," I told him. "Start from when you sat down." George set his champagne glass on a nearby ledge and crossed his arms the way he always did when he was being precise about something. "I got to the club at 7:30 Thursday evening. My usual table wasn't ready, so I waited at the bar. The booth directly behind my bar stool, I didn't notice who was in it until I heard Brandon's voice. By then, I'd already heard enough that sitting down somewhere else would have looked deliberate. "Smart," I said. "I've been in business long enough to know when to stay still." He glanced briefly at the room, then back at me. "Brandon was doing most of the talking. The other man, your Victor Hale, was asking questions. Specific questions. The kind a lawyer asks when he's confirming details for a document he's already drafted." My back teeth pressed together. "What kind of questions?" "Acreage, deed history, whether the trust instrument had a single trustee or co-trustee provision." George held my gaze steadily. He asked Brandon directly, "Is the trustee authorization in place?" And Brandon said, without any hesitation at all, "It will be by Friday." The room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. "That was 2 days ago," I said. "Today is Sunday." "Yes, it is," George said. "And I've been trying to figure out what by Friday meant ever since." I knew what it meant. It meant Natalie. It meant whatever she had signed 3 days ago that her husband had called routine paperwork. My chest felt like something was pressing on it from the inside. Not pain exactly, but pressure. The kind of pressure that builds when you've been holding something back for too long, and the walls are finally starting to give. "There's one more thing," George said, "and this one I want you to hear carefully, Ed, because it changes the shape of everything else." He lowered his voice another degree. Brandon mentioned Senator Caldwell by name. He said, and I'm quoting again because I wrote it down, "Caldwell being in the room when I announce it gives the whole thing civic weight. Nobody argues with a sitting state senator standing 2 feet away, nodding along. Senator Robert Caldwell, a Florida state senator, a man I had known for 40 years, long before he had a title back, when we were both young men trying to make something of ourselves in a city that ate young men alive if you let it. I had introduced him to his first major donor. He had been a pallbearer at Maggie's funeral. Brandon thought he was using Robert Caldwell as furniture. The pressure in my chest shifted into something sharper and more focused, not anger, not yet, but the particular clarity that comes when a situation you've been trying to understand in fog suddenly becomes visible in full daylight. Brandon hadn't just been greedy. He had been architectural about it, methodical, every piece placed with care. And he had believed completely that the pieces included people who were mine long before they were anything to him. I looked across the room and found Victor Hale without difficulty. He was standing near the east windows now, one hand in his jacket pocket, the other turning his wine glass slowly in a way that meant he was thinking rather than drinking. He was wearing a watch I recognized, a gold Rolex date, just the same one he'd been wearing 4 years ago when he'd sat across from me in my office on Brickell Avenue and tried to convince me that a waterfront development project in Homestead was worth betting my name on. I had walked him to the elevator that day and told him politely and permanently that we would not be doing business together. He hadn't seen me yet, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. "George," I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without reacting because we're in a room full of people, and I need you to look like a man who's just been told something mildly interesting about the weather." George raised an eyebrow. "I've been managing my face in rooms like this since before you had gray hair, Ed." Yet fair point. I kept my voice level and my eyes on the middle distance, not on George, not on anyone in particular. There are things already in motion tonight that I did not start alone. People I trust have been working on this for over a year. By 9:30, there will be people in this building who are not here for the party. George was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, Frank Donahue, among others. Good God! He exhaled slowly through his nose, the George Patterson version of a sharp intake of breath. "How long have you known it would come to this?" "I've known something was coming for 3 years, I said. "I've known it would be tonight for about 10 days. George looked at the room the way a man looks at something he's seeing differently than he did a moment ago. The same objects, the same light, but with a new understanding of what they mean. His eyes moved briefly to Victor Hale, then to Brandon near the stage, then back to me. "What do you need from me?" "Right now, just keep standing here and talking to me like this is a normal conversation." I finally allowed myself a single sip of the champagne I'd been holding for 20 minutes. It was warm and flat. "Later tonight, I may need your voice." George straightened slightly, a small movement, but one I recognized. It was the same movement he'd made in 1987 when we'd shaken hands on the founding agreement for Hargrove Capital, the moment a man shifts from considering something to being committed to it. "You've had it for 37 years, he said quietly. "You know that." Across the room near the terrace doors, the woman in the navy dress had put her phone away. She had picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter, but she wasn't drinking it either. She was watching the room with the kind of focused, unhurried attention that had nothing to do with cocktail hour. I said to George, "There's someone I need to speak with. Give me 10 minutes. 10 minutes was generous. It took me 4. She was standing with her back to the terrace doors, holding a champagne glass. She had no intention of drinking, watching the room the way a chess player watches a board. Not any one piece, but the whole of it, reading lines of movement that hadn't happened yet. She was in her mid-40s, composed in a way that went beyond poise, wearing a dress that was just expensive enough to belong in the room without drawing attention to itself. When I was about 8 feet away, she turned and looked at me. No surprise, no adjustment of expression, just a slight nod as if I had arrived exactly when expected. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. "Sophia." I kept my voice low and my body language easy, 2 old acquaintances running into each other at a party. "How long have you been here?" "Since 6 o'clock, said Sophia Reeves, "my director of financial operations for the past 11 years. The person who knew the internal architecture of Hargrove Capital's trust structure better than anyone alive except Frank Donahue." Brandon's setup crew arrived at 5:30. Victor Hale checked in at 6:20 with a black briefcase. He went directly to the private VIP suite on this floor and stayed there for 40 minutes before coming down. My stomach tightened. "The briefcase. Still with him?" I got close enough at the bar to see the latch custom combination lock, the kind you use for documents you don't want, going through regular hotel security. She glanced briefly past my shoulder, then back. He's been nursing the same glass of Merlot for 90 minutes. He's not here to enjoy himself. No, I agreed. He's here to execute. I positioned myself so that my back was partially to the room, and only Sophia could see my face clearly. What about Natalie? Sophia's expression shifted not much, but I had worked with this woman for 11 years, and I knew every degree of that shift. This one meant she had information that was going to hurt. 3 days ago, Brandon presented her with a packet of documents at the kitchen counter. He told her it was the quarterly tax authorization package, same paperwork she signs every year. He was on his phone the entire time he set it in front of her, talking to someone barely looking at her. Just slid the pen across the counter and said, "Same as last year, babe, just need your initials on the tabs." My jaw tightened so hard it ached. How many documents in the packet? 6. 5 of them were exactly what he said they were. The 6th was not. She paused. Frank has had it analyzed since this afternoon. I'll let him walk you through the full legal picture when he arrives, but the short version is, it was not a tax authorization. The weight of that landed somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. She didn't know, I said. It wasn't a question. It was the thing I needed to say out loud because the alternative that my daughter had known and agreed was something I was not ready to carry tonight on top of everything else. She did not know, Sophia said, and the certainty in her voice was the first genuinely clean thing I had felt since walking through the front door. I'm confident of that. The way Brandon structured the signing, the distraction, the rushed context, the framing as routine, it was designed specifically so she wouldn't look closely. He's done it before with smaller things. This time, he did it with something that mattered. I breathed in through my nose, slow, deliberate. The way Maggie used to tell me to breathe when I was about to say something I couldn't take back. "Frank," I said, "when?" 9:30. He's driving up from Coconut Grove. He won't come through the main entrance. Sophia reached into her clutch and produced a small white card, which she held briefly between 2 fingers, before I took it without making the gesture visible to anyone nearby. "That's the East Service Corridor access code. He'll come up that way with Diana and the rest of the team." Diana. Agent Diana Morse, a name I had heard from Frank exactly once 3 months ago, when he had told me with the particular understatement he reserved for serious things that a federal financial crimes investigator had independently opened a file on Brandon Sinclair 18 months prior, and that our interests, as he put it, had recently aligned. "How many on Diana's team?" I asked. 4 including her. They're already in the building. 2 are embedded with hotel security on this floor. 2 are in the parking structure. She took a small sip of her champagne, the first I'd seen her drink. "They've been here since 4 o'clock. 4 o'clock. Brandon had been setting up his stage while federal investigators were already walking his perimeter. "Yes, Daniel," I said. "Checked into the Marriott on Brickell Avenue yesterday morning," Sophia said. "He flew in from Chicago on Saturday. I briefed him by phone on Friday, full picture everything Frank and I have been building." She looked at me directly. "He wants to see you, Mr. Hargrove. He has something from the Chicago courthouse that adds another layer to Brandon's history, something that predates his relationship with Natalie." My chest tightened again, but differently this time. Daniel. My son, who had been methodically cut out of this family's life over the course of 3 years by a man who had correctly identified him as the one person most likely to call Brandon exactly what he was. 3 years of engineered silence. Deleted messages, redirected calls, a steady drip of small misrepresentations, fed to Natalie until she believed her own brother had chosen distance over family. He had been 40 minutes away this entire time. "Is he safe?" I asked. The question came out before I could dress it in anything more dignified, and I didn't try to take it back. Sophia's expression softened by 1 degree, the closest she came to warmth in professional settings. "He's fine, Mr. Hargrove. He's been fine. He just needed you to be ready before he walked into this building." I turned the white card over in my fingers, once then tucked it into my inside jacket pocket. "You should know," I said, "that I owe you and Frank an apology I don't have the right words for yet. 14 months of work that you did without being asked." "You asked in 2019, she said simply. "When you signed the power of attorney, you told Frank and I was in that office, I heard you say it. You said, 'Protect the trust from anything I don't see coming.' We took that seriously." The faintest trace of something that might have been dry humor moved across her face. We just didn't expect the timeline to include a Father's Day party at the Fontainebleau. Neither did I admitted. She glanced past me once more, then back with a small, precise nod. You should get back to George. Dinner service starts in 15 minutes, and you'll want to be sitting down and looking unremarkable when Brandon takes the microphone. She adjusted the strap of her clutch. I'll be here. I'll be watching. I turned to go, then stopped. Sophia. She looked at me. The woman who raised Natalie her name was Margaret Hargrove. Everyone called her Maggie. She was the one who built the trust that's protecting everything tonight. My voice held, barely. I want you to know that. Sophia held my gaze for a moment. I know, she said quietly. I've read every document she ever signed. She was very precise about what she wanted protected. I nodded once and walked back toward George. By the time I got back to George, the room had shifted from cocktail hour to something with more structure. Staff were moving through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 100 times, redirecting guests toward their tables, clearing empty glasses, adjusting the lighting, by a degree that most people wouldn't notice. But that changed the room's mood from social to ceremonial. George handed me a fresh glass of water without being asked. Better, he said. Clearer, I replied. We found our seats a table near the west windows, set slightly apart from the main configuration. Not the head table, not anywhere near it. Brandon had placed us at what the event industry calls a courtesy table, close enough to look inclusive, far enough to be peripheral. I pulled out my chair and sat down like a man with nowhere better to be, which was exactly the impression I wanted to give. The table sat 8. George was on my left. The other 6 seats filled with people I recognized from Miami's peripheral business circles. An architect from Coral Gables, a commercial real estate attorney, and his wife, a retired city commissioner who smelled faintly of cigars. Polite people, safe people. People Brandon had correctly calculated would not cause complications. At the head table, maybe 30 feet away, Brandon sat between Natalie and Senator Robert Caldwell. He was in his element, shoulders back, chin slightly elevated, talking with the easy fluency of a man who had been rehearsing this evening for months. Caldwell was listening with the attentive expression of someone being courted his silver hair, catching the light from the chandelier above. And then James Whitmore Miami's most requested event, MC. A man I'd seen work 100 rooms over 20 years, stepped up to the small podium near the stage. He was 50 years old, silver at his temples, with the kind of warm baritone that made every room feel like it was being held rather than hosted. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. He said, his voice rolling smoothly over the crowd noise until it quieted. Welcome to a celebration of legacy and evening, honoring the Sinclair Hargrove family vision and the next chapter of what they've built together. The Sinclair Hargrove family vision. Whitmore, to his credit, was reading from a card. He hadn't written those words, but I watched him glance up briefly from the card as he said them, and something in his expression, a small tightening around the eyes, told me he was a professional doing his job and not a man personally invested in the framing. I filed that away. The koa vai arrived, seared scallops with a citrus reduction, which I moved around my plate while making appropriate conversation with the architect on my right about a building project in Wynwood he was excited about. I asked questions. I nodded at the right moments. I was performing normalcy with the focused energy of a man whose mind was entirely somewhere else. And then Natalie appeared beside my chair. She had crossed the room without catching Brandon's eye. I watched her do it, that practiced sideways navigation of a woman who had learned how to move through a space without triggering her husband's attention. She sat down in the empty chair next to me with the fluid motion of someone making a casual, spontaneous decision, and she touched my arm lightly. "Dad," she said. Her voice was low and carefully controlled, but her eyes were doing something her voice wasn't. They were tight at the corners, bright in a way that meant she was holding something back hard. "I need you to hear me right now. Please." I turned to look at my daughter, this woman in sapphire blue, who had her mother's cheekbones and her mother's stubbornness, and who was currently gripping my forearm with fingers that were trembling slightly at the knuckles. My chest ached at the sight of it. "I'm listening," I said. "Don't do anything tonight." The words came out quiet and urgent, pressed down to barely above a whisper. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't. This is important, for all of us." I kept my voice level and my face neutral. "Important for who, Natalie?" She flinched slightly, just a small movement, a tightening of the jaw, and then recovered. "For the family. For what we're building." What you're building," I said, "or what he's selling." Her fingers tightened on my arm. Her eyes went bright and wet for just a moment, just one moment, and then she pulled them back from the edge with the visible effort of someone who had practiced not crying in public until it became mechanical. "That's not fair," she said, her voice cracking on the last word before she smoothed it back out. "No," I said, and I kept my voice gentle because she was my daughter, and I loved her, and nothing about this evening was her fault in the way she thought it was. "It isn't fair. You're right about that." She looked at me, then really looked at me the way she used to when she was 12 years old, and trying to figure out if I was angry or just disappointed, which she had always said was worse. I held her gaze and let her read whatever she needed to read in my face. "I just need tonight to go smoothly," she said finally. And there was something in those words that broke my heart in a specific quiet way, not because she was wrong, but because she believed that smooth and good were still the same thing, that they still could be. I put my hand over hers on my arm. "I know you do," I said. "I know." She held my gaze for one more second, then stood composed herself with a small breath and walked back to the head table. I watched her sit down and say something to Brandon that made him put his hand briefly on her shoulder without looking at her, his attention still on Caldwell. George leaned toward me from my left. "She knows more than she's letting on," he said quietly. "She knows what he's told her," I replied. "Which means she knows enough to be afraid of what tonight could become, but not enough to know what it already is." George was quiet for a moment, then, "How are you holding up, Ed?" I looked at my plate. The scallops had gone cold. "I'm fine," I said. Then, because it was George, and lying to George had never been something I was good at, "No, my heart is in my throat, but I'm fine." He patted my arm, once the way men of our generation express things we don't have words for, and then picked up his fork. "Then eat something," he said. "Long night ahead." Across the room, Brandon stood up from his chair. He adjusted the button on his jacket once precisely, and Whitmore leaned smoothly into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brandon Sinclair has a few words he'd like to share on this very special Father's Day evening." The room quieted. I set down my fork, and somewhere at the back of the ballroom, I knew without looking that Sophia had straightened up from the wall. Brandon Sinclair at a microphone was a particular kind of performance. He didn't rush to the podium. He stood from his chair slowly unhurried the way a man stands when he wants the room to understand that the room belongs to him. He buttoned his jacket one button, the same gesture I'd watched him make before every important meeting for 3 years. And he walked to the front with that particular rhythm of confidence that fills a room before a word is spoken. The spotlight caught him perfectly. I noticed the angle. Someone had said it deliberately. "Thank you, James," he said, and his voice was warm and full and calibrated to the back row. "And thank you all for being here tonight. When Natalie and I started planning this evening, we kept coming back to one idea: legacy. What it means to build something that outlasts you. What it means to honor the people who made it possible." He paused. A practiced pause just long enough for the word to settle. "Margaret Hargrove built this family's foundation," he said. "Maggie, as everyone who loved her called her, had a vision for what this company could be that went beyond balance sheets and property portfolios. She believed in something larger." His voice dropped half a register, the way grief sounds when it's being performed rather than felt. "We lost her too soon, but the legacy she built, the land she loved, the trust she established, the values she instilled, those things are alive in everything Hargrove Capital does." Natalie's hand moved to her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, just once, before she composed herself. And the rage that moved through me in that moment was not the hot, blinding kind. It was cold and precise, like a blade that knows exactly where it's going. He was using Maggie's name to sell her land, which is why, Brandon continued, his voice lifting again, "Tonight I want to talk about what it means to honor legacy, not by preserving it in amber, but by investing it, by making it grow." He looked toward the projection screen behind him, and right on cue, the lights dimmed and a slide appeared. A map, Pelican Bay. 12 acres of southern Fisher Island, coastline the beach, where Maggie had planted sea grapes and morning glories and drunk her coffee every morning until she couldn't anymore. The slide showed it from above, clean lines, the kind of aerial perspective that makes land look like an asset rather than a memory. Below the map, a number $47 million. The Pelican Bay parcel, Brandon said, has been an underutilized asset in the Hargrove Trust for over a decade. Tonight I'm proud to announce that we have identified a strategic buyer, a hospitality development group from Dallas, with a proven track record in luxury coastal properties, and that the Hargrove family is aligned in moving forward with this transition. The room responded with a murmur of approval, heads nodding, a smattering of applause beginning to build. Senator Caldwell was sitting perfectly still, his expression attentive and undecipherable. Victor Hale, near the east windows, allowed himself a small, private smile. I felt George's knee press once against mine under the table, a signal. I gave him nothing back, not yet. This isn't just a transaction. Brandon continued, his voice swelling now, with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. This is an investment in the next generation of what this family stands for. The proceeds will fund a new acquisition strategy that Natalie and I have been developing for the past 18 months. A strategy that positions Hargrove Capital not just for growth, but for a kind of growth that Maggie herself would have been proud of. The applause built properly now, 40-50 people clapping. Whitmore was smiling from his podium. A woman near the front dabbed at her eye. And at the head table, Natalie, my daughter, who was holding her champagne glass in both hands so that the trembling would be less visible, was looking at the slide behind her husband with an expression I had seen on her face only once before, at her mother's funeral. The expression of someone watching something irreversible happen and not yet understanding that it is. I pushed back my chair. It didn't scrape loudly. I didn't make a production of it. I simply stood up the way a man stands up when he has decided something, and I began walking toward the front of the room. George made a small sound, something between a breath and a word, and then did not try to stop me. The applause was still going when the first few people near the aisle noticed me walking. It faded unevenly the way a sound fades when something interrupts the frequency. I watched the ripple move through the room, a turning of heads, a lowering of hands, a subtle reconfiguration of attention that reached the front table before I did. Natalie saw me first. Her face went white. Her champagne glass came down hard on the table, and she half rose from her chair, one hand extended toward me, as if she could stop me from 30 feet away with a gesture alone. "Dad," she said, barely audible. Brandon turned around. He saw me coming. He saw the room watching him see me coming. And something happened in his face that I found in that moment deeply informative. The smile didn't disappear. It changed. It became smaller and flatter and colder, the smile of a man deciding in real time how to neutralize a complication. He waited until I was close enough, then lifted the microphone and said with practiced ease, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce a very special surprise guest this evening, my father-in-law, Edward Hargrove." A ripple of polite applause. The Hargrove and Sinclair Hargrove. He added with a laugh that invited the room to laugh along. A few people did. I stopped 4 feet from him and looked him directly in the eye. "That land," I said clearly enough for the nearest microphone to catch, "is not yours to sell." The laughter stopped. The room went so quiet I could hear the ocean. Brandon looked at me for exactly 3 seconds, during which I watched him weigh every option available to a man whose timeline has just been disrupted in front of 200 people and a state senator. Then he lowered the microphone, slightly turned his body just enough to cut the room out of the immediate angle, and said to me, quiet and flat, "You're not on the guest list for a reason, old man. Go sit down before you make a fool of yourself." My jaw tightened. My hands were steady. "Maggie would never have allowed this," I said, "and you know it." Something moved across Brandon Sinclair's face, then something fast and involuntary. Something that broke the surface of the careful performance for just a fraction of a second before he shut it back down. Not anger, fear. The fear of a man who has built an entire structure on the assumption that a certain name would never be spoken in a certain tone, in a certain room, by a certain person. And then his arm moved. The applause that followed Brandon's announcement was the kind that fills a room without meaning anything, polished, reflexive, the sound of people clapping because everyone else was clapping. I did not clap. I set my champagne glass on the nearest table, the crystal stem clicking against white linen like a quiet gavel, and I stood up. My legs were steady. My hands were steady. My chest, however, felt like someone had reached inside and wrapped a fist around my heart, squeezing slowly, deliberately, the way a man squeezes something he intends to break. Brandon still held the microphone. He was turned towards Senator Caldwell, laughing at something the senator had said. His shoulders relaxed, his whole posture radiating the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Victor Hale stood 2 tables away, his gold Rolex catching the chandelier, Light, his expression carefully neutral, the practiced calm of a man waiting to see which way things would fall. I started walking. 6 feet from the podium, I stopped. "Brandon?" My voice came out quieter than I expected, but it carried. The nearest tables heard it. Heads turned slowly at first, then faster the way a crowd senses trouble before it understands it. Brandon's smile didn't disappear. It simply recalculated. "Ed!" He said my name the way you'd acknowledge a piece of furniture that had rearranged itself. "I didn't realize you were still here," I finished. "I know you didn't." Behind me, I heard Natalie pull in a sharp breath, the kind that lives just ahead of tears. I felt her the way you feel a storm, coming, a shift in pressure, something imminent. I did not turn around. "This isn't the time," Brandon said, his voice dropping to a register meant only for me, warm on the surface, a blade underneath. "We have guests, Ed, important guests." "Senator Caldwell." I turned and nodded once toward the senator's table. "Robert, good to see you." Senator Caldwell rose slightly from his chair. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, absorbing everything. "Ed," he said, returning the nod with quiet gravity. Brandon's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered below his left eye. "The Pelican Bay parcel," I said, turning back to Brandon and making no effort to lower my voice. "That land was placed into the Hargrove Family Trust in 2009. My wife Maggie chose that parcel herself. She drove out there on a Tuesday in October, came home with red clay on her shoes, and laughed about it for a week." My throat tried to close around the memory. I pushed straight through it. "That land is not yours to sell, Brandon." Something left his face all at once. The warmth, the calculation, the performance gone. What replaced it was rawer and uglier, the face of a man who had been cornered and knew it, a face I had seen once before when I had called his first acquisition reckless. He had looked at me then, the way he looked at me now, like something he wanted gone. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said through barely parted teeth. "Natalie authorized the—" "Natalie signed documents she did not read," I said. "Because you placed them in front of her at 11 o'clock at night, after dinner, after 2 glasses of wine, and you told her it was routine paperwork." A ripple moved through the nearest tables, not quite a gasp, but close, the sound of people recalibrating what they were witnessing. "Dad!" Natalie's voice broke on that single syllable, and that one sound hit me harder than anything else in the room. She sounded like she was 12 years old again, standing at the foot of the stairs the night Maggie got her first diagnosis, asking me if everything was going to be all right. I had told her yes. I had been wrong that night. I would not be wrong tonight. "That is enough." Brandon set the microphone down hard. The amplified thud rang through the ballroom like a gunshot. He stepped off the low platform and covered the 6 feet between us in 3 strides. He was close enough now that I could smell the bourbon on his breath, see the cord standing out in his neck, feel the heat radiating off him. "You have no idea," he said, his voice dropping to something vicious and private, "what you have just done to yourself." "I have every idea," I told him. His hand moved before the room could register it. The sound was flat and sharp and wrong, the kind of sound that belongs in a locked room, somewhere shameful, not a grand ballroom with 200 people in black tie. My head snapped left. The sting bloomed across my cheekbone like fire spreading through dry grass. For 1 full second, the entire room stopped breathing. Then it broke open. George was on his feet, his chair scraping back so hard it nearly toppled, his face blazing red, his whole arm extended and shaking. "Brandon, he just hit him." His voice cracked with raw disbelief. "He just struck Ed, in front of all these people." James Whitmore was at the microphone in seconds, his professional composure holding by the thinnest possible thread, his face drained of color. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm." Senator Caldwell stood fully upright. He straightened his jacket with 2 precise movements, looked at Brandon for a long, measuring moment, and then looked at me. Whatever he had come to this party expecting, it had not been this. I raised my right hand, a small, deliberate gesture, the kind you use to stop traffic, and touched my cheekbone. The skin was burning. The corner of my eye was watering, despite every effort I made to prevent it. The pain was real, specific, and radiating outward in pulses. Good. Pain was evidence, and evidence was exactly what the next hour would require. "Brandon," my voice to my own surprise was remarkably steady. "Thank you." His chest was heaving. His knuckles were white at his sides. "You think this is—" I said, that you just did precisely what I knew you would do." Natalie had both hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide, and devastated, her whole body trembling as she stared at her husband. Tears were running freely down her face, and she made no move to stop them. "Brandon, what did you... Oh God, what did you just do?" Victor Hale had taken 3 quiet steps toward the far exit. He had not yet reached it. The room churned around me, voices overlapping chairs, moving people rising in ripples, not knowing whether to intervene or retreat, or simply stand and bear witness to the thing they had just seen in this beautiful room on this summer night. I turned away from Brandon, pressed 2 fingers lightly against my burning cheek, and walked toward the corridor door. The night had barely started. The corridor beyond the grand ballroom was all marble and muted light, the kind of deliberate quiet that luxury hotels engineer like a product, every surface polished to erase evidence of anything messy or human or true. I walked until the ballroom noise faded behind the heavy doors. Then I stopped beside a window overlooking the ocean and pressed my palm flat against the cold glass. The Atlantic was black and enormous out there, broken only by the running lights of a cargo ship moving south along the horizon. I stared at it and breathed, and the burning across my cheek pulsed with every heartbeat. I pulled out my phone. Most men in my position would have called Frank Donahue first. Frank was my lawyer, my oldest friend, the man who had spent 45 years making sure the Hargrove name stayed clean. And Frank was already on his way. Sophia had confirmed it 12 minutes out. But Frank would arrive when Frank arrived. What I needed right now was not a lawyer. I pressed Daniel's name. The line rang once, twice. "Dad!" His voice came low and careful, the voice of a man who had been awake for hours, waiting for a call that hadn't come yet. "Are you okay?" Someone down in the lobby said there was that something happened in the ballroom. "He hit me," I said. My voice came out flat and factual, the way you describe weather to a stranger. A sharp intake of breath, a pause no longer than a heartbeat. Then, Brandon. "Yes, I'm in the stairwell." The sound of a metal door, footsteps on concrete. "I'm coming to you right now. Where are you? What floor?" "East corridor, 2nd floor. Window by the terrace stairwell." 90 seconds, he said. The line stayed open. I could hear him moving, hear his breathing, and the ordinary sound of it. My son, breathing hard, running toward me, did something to the back of my throat that I had not allowed myself all evening. My eyes burned, and this time it had nothing to do with the impact. "Daniel." My voice wasn't as steady as I wanted it to be. "I'm here, Dad. I'm right here." He came through the stairwell door 80 seconds later. Navy blazer, open collar hair, slightly disheveled, the look of a man who had been sitting somewhere tense for hours waiting for the moment he was needed. When he saw my face, when he saw my cheek, he crossed the corridor in 4 fast strides and put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me with his jaw clenched and his eyes running hot. "And that son of a..." He stopped himself. His hands gripped my shoulders once hard, then gentled. He tilted my face toward the corridor light, examining the mark with the focused intensity of someone who wanted desperately to undo what they were looking at. His fingers, when they hovered near my cheek, were trembling faintly. "It's going to bruise, Dad. It's already swelling." "I know," I said. "He hit you." Daniel's voice came out rough and fractured, not from weakness, but from an anger he was working very hard to keep measured. His eyes were bright and wet at the edges. "He struck you in front of 200 people. In front of Senator Caldwell, in front of Dad. What was he thinking? Oh, Ispam, that..." "He wasn't thinking," I said. "That was the point." Daniel pulled back slightly and looked at me. Really looked at me the way sons sometimes look at their fathers and suddenly see someone both more vulnerable and more deliberate than they expected. "You wanted this," he said slowly. "You wanted him to react. I needed a witness," I said. 200 of them, as it turns out. Something moved through Daniel's expression, disbelief giving way to recognition. Then a cold, precise fury that reminded me of myself at 40 in rooms I had walked into, knowing exactly what I was doing and why. He exhaled slowly. "Tell me where we are. All of it." "Pelican Bay parcel," I said. "Brandon announced the sale tonight as a fait accompli. The documents supporting the announcement include a packet Natalie signed 6 pages 1, of which Sophia believes contains an unauthorized transfer of beneficial interest. Brandon had her sign it at 11 at night under the pretense of routine filings." Daniel's face sharpened immediately. "The trust requires dual trustee authorization. You and..." He stopped. unless he found a way around the succession clause. That is exactly what I need you to determine. I have the original trust instrument. His voice was already moving faster, more focused. Frank sent it to me 3 weeks ago. It's on my laptop 2 floors up. He paused, his eyes searching mine. Dad, why didn't you tell me any of this when it started? Why did you wait until tonight? The question sat between us, honest and fair and slightly painful. Because you went to Chicago, I said. After Maggie died, after everything with the company, you built something of your own. I didn't want to reach back and pull you into wreckage that wasn't yours to carry. Daniel's face did something complicated. His mouth pressed flat, his jaw worked, and his eyes went bright with a specific frustration, the kind that comes from being protected from something you had every right to know. His hands came back to my forearms, gripping hard. I am your son, he said, his voice rough and low and absolute. Not someone you spare from hard news. I am your son, Dad. That means I carry this with you. That's what it means. I know. The words came out quieter than I intended. I know it does. He held my arms for a moment longer. Then he straightened, squared his shoulders, and the grief in his face reorganized itself into something harder and more useful. Sophia, is she in the building? She is. Frank, 10 minutes. Then we have 10 minutes. He was already moving toward the stairwell, already pulling out his phone. Come with me, and don't touch that cheek. That bruise needs to be documented exactly as it is. He glanced back at me over his shoulder, and for one unguarded second I saw Maggie in the line of his jaw, her directness, her refusal to flinch, the way she had always moved toward the hard thing, rather than away from it. Brandon just handed us everything we need, Daniel said. He just doesn't know it yet. I followed my son toward the stairwell door. Behind us, through the walls and the polished marble floors, the grand ballroom hummed with the aftermath of a room that had witnessed something it could never take back. Somewhere inside, Brandon Sinclair was learning what every man learns too late, that striking someone in anger is not a victory. It is a confession. And 10 minutes from now, Frank Donahue would walk through the front entrance carrying the response. Daniel's room on the 4th floor of the Fontainebleau was a standard suite, yet far nicer than most places I'd stayed in my 30s. A yellow legal pad covered in handwritten notes sat beside his open laptop under the glow of a desk lamp next to a half-drunk cold cup of coffee. He had been working here for hours. Sit down, Dad. He pulled the desk chair out and pointed at it with the quiet certainty of a man directing a site crew. Let me get the document open. I sat. My cheek throbbed in steady pulses, the heat spreading toward my eye socket. I pressed my fingers against the armrest, watching my son's hands move across the keyboard with quick precision. Yet Frank sent you the full instrument? I asked. The full instrument, the 2019 amendment, and the power of attorney filings. Daniel said, scrolling rapidly through a PDF. There's a section I want you to look at. He turned the laptop. Right there, section 14, subsection C. I leaned forward and read, in the event of trustee incapacity or voluntary resignation, distribution authority shall revert to the primary grantor Edward James Hargrove until a successor trustee is formally appointed by majority written consent of all named beneficiaries. I read it twice. Then I looked up. Brandon was never formally appointed as successor trustee. He was never formally appointed as anything. Daniel said, his voice tight. Dad Brandon assumed his marriage to Natalie gave him operational authority over trust assets. It doesn't. The trust recognizes named trustees, not spousal authority. And the only named trustee since Mom's death is you. Relief and fury tangled together in my chest. Then the Pelican Bay sale is void from inception. Daniel straightened up, running hands through his hair. He cannot sell that land. The beneficial interest transfer Sophia flagged carries no legal weight because Natalie is a beneficiary, not a trustee. Beneficiaries cannot authorize distribution. That's basic trust law. His jaw tightened. He knew this, Dad. You don't put a 6-document packet in front of your wife at 11 at night by accident. He was going to sell Mom's land and move the money before anyone realized the authorization was fraudulent. The room felt suddenly smaller. Outside, the Miami night hummed with indifferent traffic. There's something else, Daniel said, scrolling further. The trust has a poison pill clause, section 22. Any attempt to transfer or encumber trust assets without proper dual trustee authorization automatically triggers a 48-hour administrative freeze on all trust-affiliated accounts enforced through the custodial bank. I stared at the screen. That clause was added in 2019. Frank pushed for it after the Clearwater dispute. I forgot about it. The freeze triggered automatically, Daniel said with faint satisfaction. The moment he made a formal public statement of intent to transfer a trust-held asset without authorization, Section 22 activated. The sale is frozen. Brandon announced a sale that was already dead. He just didn't know it yet, I said. Daniel pressed the heels of his hands against his strained, red-rimmed eyes. Dad? He asked quietly. Is Natalie okay? What is she doing right now? My throat tightened. She was crying when I left. She was looking at Brandon like she'd never seen him before. Daniel nodded slowly. She didn't know what he was doing. She knew some of it, I said. And she chose not to look too closely at the rest. That's different. I know. He sipped his cold coffee, grimacing. I've been angry at her for 3 years, Dad. I need to fix that. You will, I said. But first, 3 sharp measured raps struck the door. Frank, I said. Daniel was already moving. Before I reveal what Frank Donahue carried into that hotel room, and I promise you nothing you have heard so far could have prepared you for this, leave me a still here in the comments so I know who's watching. Because what comes next is not just a twist. It is 18 months of careful silence finally walking through a door, and it is going to reframe every single thing you thought you understood about this story from the beginning. Quick note before we go, further parts of this story include fictional elements built for entertainment and meaningful reflection. Names, places, and details are coincidental, but the lesson buried inside all of it, that one is worth keeping. Franklin Donahue looked exactly the same at 72 as he had at 55. The same iron gray hair, the same reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the same charcoal suit that he wore to depositions and dinners, and apparently to hotel rooms on Sunday nights when the situation demanded it. He carried a worn leather briefcase in his left hand and held the door with his right, and he looked at my face for exactly 2 seconds before his expression did the thing it always did when Frank encountered something that offended his sense of order. His mouth went flat, his eyes went cold, and you could see the lawyer assembling itself behind his face, like a machine coming online. Ed, he said. Frank? That cheek needs to be photographed tonight. He stepped inside, set the briefcase on the bed, and turned to the woman who had walked in behind him. She was perhaps 39, lean and precise, in a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, dark hair pulled back cleanly, a badge case clipped to her belt that she made no effort to conceal. She moved into the room with the particular economy of someone who cataloged everything in a space within seconds of entering it. The laptop on the desk, the legal pad, Daniel's cold coffee, my swollen cheek. Mr. Hargrove, she said, extending her hand to me. Diana Morse. I'm a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI's Miami field office. I've been working with Mr. Donahue for the past 18 months on a matter that intersects very directly with what happened in the ballroom tonight. Her grip was firm and brief. Her eyes were sharp and entirely without warmth. The way a scalpel is sharp and entirely without warmth, the tool is not unkind. It is simply precise. I'm sorry about your cheek. Don't be, I said. It was planned. Diana glanced at Frank. Frank gave a small nod that said, I'll explain later. She accepted this and moved to the desk where she set down a slim black folder without opening it. Dad, this is Agent Morse. Daniel looked between Frank and Diana, his brow tight with the effort of recalibrating. You brought a federal agent to the party. I brought her to the building, Frank said, clicking open his briefcase. She was in the building before I arrived. She's been here since 7. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it on the bed beside the briefcase, then a second thinner envelope, and finally a USB drive in a sealed evidence sleeve. 18 months, Daniel. Diana's team has been building a financial crimes case against Brandon Sinclair for 18 months. What happened tonight? The announcement? The documents? The assault? He paused, glancing at my cheek with an expression that, for just a moment, was not a lawyer's expression at all, but an old friend's. Something flickered in his eyes, grief or fury, or both compacted together. He cleared his throat. Tonight accelerated our timeline considerably. What exactly are we looking at? Daniel asked, pulling the desk chair closer to the bed so the 4 of us formed a rough circle. Diana opened the black folder. Brandon Sinclair has been running a parallel financial operation using Hargrove Capital's corporate identity as a shell. She said, her voice even, and clinical. Over the past 26 months, he has routed approximately $4.3 million through a series of LLCs registered in Delaware and Nevada, ultimately depositing into accounts held at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. She turned one of the documents toward us, a wire transfer summary, columns of numbers, account codes, dates. The Pelican Bay transaction was designed to generate a clean, large-sum transfer that would allow him to settle a debt against those Cayman accounts without triggering standard AML reporting thresholds. The room went very still. Daniel's hand resting on his knee curled slowly into a fist. He was using Hargrove Capital. Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was using Dad's company, Mom's company, to cover his own debts. He was using the company name, the corporate relationships, and your sister's signatory authority to lend legitimacy to transactions he could not otherwise execute, Diana said. She was not unkind in her directness, but she did not soften it either. The facts were the facts. Natalie's signatory authority, I said. My voice sounded strange to me, hollow like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. He married her for it. Frank looked at me across the bed. His eyes were steady and full of something he would never say out loud in a room with a federal agent. He had known Maggie. He had danced with Maggie at our wedding, held her hand at her diagnosis, stood beside me at her grave. He had watched me hand my daughter to Brandon Sinclair 4 years ago, and he had smiled because I had asked him to smile. Ed. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I should have pushed harder in 2020. I looked at Brandon's financials before the wedding, and I had a feeling, not evidence, just a feeling, and I let it go because Natalie was happy and you were... Don't! My throat was tight. Frank, don't! He nodded, once pressed his lips together, and straightened. The lawyer came back. The USB contains 18 months of documentation, wire transfers, corporate filings, email chains between Brandon and Victor Hale, and a recording. He looked at Daniel. Victor Hale turned cooperative 3 days ago. Daniel's head came up sharply. Victor Hale provided Agent Morse's team with 2 years of communications. In exchange for... Frank glanced at Diana. Consideration regarding his own exposure, Diana said precisely. Mr. Hale is not our primary target. Mr. Sinclair is. My hands were not entirely steady. I pressed them flat against my thighs and breathed. 18 months. Frank had been doing this for 18 months. He had watched me have dinners with Brandon, had watched me try to make the marriage work, had sat across the table from me at Christmas, and carried this like a weight he was not yet ready to put down. Why tonight? I asked. Why Father's Day? Frank met my eyes. Because Brandon planned to execute the Pelican Bay transfer tomorrow morning. Tonight was the last opportunity to have everything in place, Diana's team. The trust documents, the freeze provision before the wire cleared. He paused. And because you asked me to make it tonight. 2 weeks ago when you called me from Fisher Island and told me you'd found the paperwork on Natalie's desk. The room was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of the ocean. What happens now? Daniel asked. Diana closed the folder. Now, she said, we go back downstairs. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby level, and for a moment, the 4 of us stood in the threshold. Ed, Daniel, Frank, Diana, with the noise of the hotel wrapping around us like a current. Music from the ballroom, laughter from the bar, the soft percussion of heels on marble. The ordinary sounds of a Saturday night in Miami, completely indifferent to everything that was about to happen inside it. Frank adjusted the strap of his briefcase. Diana buttoned the single button of her blazer. Stay close, Diana said not loudly. Let me lead. Nobody moves on Brandon until I say so. Yes, understood, I said. Daniel put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one firm press, then gone, and we walked. The ballroom doors were still open. A string quartet had resumed in the corner, filling the space with something measured and graceful that felt almost obscene given the circumstances. The guests had reorganized themselves in the aftermath of the earlier seen knots of people speaking in low voices, some with their phones out, others pointedly not looking at their phones, the way people behave when they have witnessed something they are not sure they are allowed to discuss yet. Brandon was at the far end of the room near the windows overlooking the bay. He had gathered a small cluster around him, 2 men I didn't recognize in expensive suits, and Victor Hale standing slightly apart from the group with a glass of water, and the expression of a man counting the seconds until he could leave. Brandon was talking. His voice carried the cadence of someone rebuilding the confident performance of a man reasserting control over a room that had seen him lose it. I watched him from across the ballroom floor and felt the strangest thing, not hatred, not triumph, not even the deep specific grief I had been carrying for 2 years. What I felt was something closer to clarity, the clean, cold certainty of a man who had waited long enough. "Ed!" George materialized at my elbow, his face tight with relief and barely contained fury. "Thank God. Where did you go? Brandon's been telling people you had some kind of episode, that you were confused, that—" "Of course he has," I said. "Senator Caldwell hasn't left," George said, lowering his voice. "He's at the corner table. He told me he was waiting to see how the evening resolved." George looked at Frank, then at Diana, then back at me, and something shifted in his expression. The particular look of a man who has just realized the chess pieces were in very different positions than he understood. "Ed, did you plan all of this?" "Not the cheek," I said. "Everything else." George let out a breath that was half laugh and half something raw. His eyes went glassy for a second, the way old men's eyes go when they are moved and refuse to cry about it. He pressed his lips together, nodded once, and fell into step beside Daniel. Senator Caldwell was indeed at the corner table. He was sitting with James Whitmore, the two of them speaking quietly. And when he saw our group cross the floor, his eyes tracked to Diana's badge, to Frank's briefcase, and then to my face. He straightened slightly. He understood institutional weight when he saw it. "Robert." Frank extended his hand and the senator rose to take it. "I'm sorry for the circumstances." "Frank Donahue." Senator Caldwell's voice was dry and measuring. "I had a feeling when Ed walked in tonight that this was not a social call." "It was not," Frank said. "I need you as a witness to what happens next. Will you stay?" The senator looked at me. I met his eyes and gave a small nod. "I'll stay," Senator Caldwell said. Diana was already moving. She crossed the ballroom floor with the quiet, purposeful stride of someone who had done this in worse places than a 5-star hotel. She had done it in warehouses and parking garages, and once Frank had told me in a church. The 2 men in suits saw her badge first and stepped back. Victor Hale saw her and went very still, his water glass hovering halfway to his mouth. Brandon saw her last. Brandon Sinclair. Diana's voice was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that carried through crowd noise the way a stone carries through water, cleanly, completely, with no wasted energy. "I'm Special Agent Diana Morse, FBI Financial Crimes Unit, Miami Field Office." She reached into her jacket and produced a folded document. "I'm serving you with a civil complaint and a formal notice of federal investigation into wire fraud, money laundering, and unauthorized use of a registered corporate identity. You are not under arrest at this time. You are, however, required to retain all financial records and communication devices pending further proceedings." The string quartet played on for 3 more notes before the violinist noticed and stopped. The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed dense with the held breath of 200 people who had already watched one impossible thing happen tonight and were now watching a second. Brandon's face went through 4 things in rapid succession: confusion, calculation, fury, and then for just a fraction of a second, fear. Real fear, the kind that lives below the performance, below the charm, below all the layers a man constructs over decades to make himself feel invulnerable. "You have no idea," he started. "Mr. Sinclair." Diana's voice did not change in temperature or volume. "I would strongly encourage you not to finish that sentence without legal representation present." Brandon's eyes cut to me. They were burning. "You did this," he said, and his voice was raw in a way I had never heard from him before, stripped of the polish, stripped of the ease. Just a man who had run out of room. "No," I said. I kept my voice level. My chest was steady now, steadier than it had been all night. "You did this. The first time you looked at my daughter and saw a signature instead of a person." Natalie made a sound from somewhere behind me, a broken, desperate sound. Not quite a sob, but close, the kind of sound that comes from a wound that has been open a long time. I heard her take a step and then stop herself, heard her breathing come in uneven pulls, heard her fighting to hold herself upright. Frank stepped forward, then opening his briefcase and removed a single envelope. He handed it to Brandon directly. "This is a formal notice that your role as acting CEO of Hargrove Capital is disputed and under legal review," Frank said. "Your signatory authority over all company accounts has been suspended pending verification of your original appointment documentation." He paused. We expect to confirm within 48 hours that no such documentation exists. Brandon took the envelope. His hand was shaking, just slightly, just enough. James Whitmore, standing near the far wall with his MC notepad still in hand, had gone the color of old paper. He looked at me with wide, stunned eyes, and I gave him the smallest nod, the nod of a man acknowledging a witness. He understood. He wrote something down. George put his hand on my arm. "Ed," he said quietly, "it's done." "Not yet," I said, "but almost." The string quartet had packed away their instruments. Most of the guests were still in the ballroom, but the geography of the room had shifted. People had moved away from Brandon, the way water moves away from something dropped into it. Concentric rings of distance, instinctive and telling. Brandon stood with the envelope in his hand and his two suited companions conspicuously no longer beside him. They had drifted toward the exit with the quiet urgency of men who had just correctly assessed the direction of a fire. Diana had stepped back 3 paces after serving the documents far enough to be professional, close enough to observe. Her eyes moved through the room with the steady efficiency of a woman cataloging everything she might need later. I was standing with Daniel and Frank near the senator's table when I saw Victor Hale move. He did not move toward the exit as I had half expected. He moved toward Diana. Daniel noticed at the same moment I did. He put his hand on my arm. "Dad," he said, his voice low and tightly controlled. "Is that Victor Hale?" I said. "Yes." Victor was 45, broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from actual outdoor work, rather than a tanning bed. He wore a navy suit that had been expensive 3 years ago and was now slightly too tight across the shoulders, the suit of a man who had made money and then begun losing it. He walked toward Diana with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this walk many times in his head. "Agent Morse." His voice was lower than I expected, rough at the edges. He stopped 2 feet from Diana and reached inside his jacket with 2 fingers slow, visible the gesture of a man who did not want to be misread. He produced a folded envelope thick with papers. "My attorney contacted your office 3 days ago. Proffer agreement. Everything in here is consistent with what I already provided to your team." He held the envelope out. "I wanted to do this here, tonight. In front of..." He stopped, and for a moment his composure cracked slightly, a hairline fracture across something that had been under enormous pressure for a long time. His voice dropped lower. "In front of the people whose family I helped him hurt. I wanted them to see it." Diana took the envelope. She looked at it then, at Victor, with the expression of someone verifying something they already knew. "This is consistent with the materials provided by your counsel on Thursday." "Yes." Victor's throat moved. "And there are 3 additional email chains in there that I didn't provide on Thursday. I found them on a backup drive last night." Diana opened the envelope, scanned the first 2 pages, and gave a small, precise nod. She tucked it under her arm. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. My team will be in contact." Victor didn't move immediately. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his jaw working like a man who has just put down something very heavy and hasn't yet figured out how to stand without the weight of it. His eyes moved across the room and found Brandon, who was watching from 20 feet away, with an expression that had gone beyond fury into something colder and more dangerous. "You," Brandon said. The word came out like something being torn. He took a step toward Victor, and Daniel moved instinctively forward, but Diana raised one hand in a small, authoritative gesture, and Brandon stopped. "Don't," Diana said. "One word. Absolute." Brandon stopped. His chest was heaving. His face was a war rage and calculation, and the dawning horrible understanding of a man who was watching his entire constructed world dismantle itself in a hotel ballroom on a Sunday night. Victor looked at Brandon for a long moment. His eyes were not triumphant. They were tired deeply, and genuinely tired, the eyes of a man who had been living with a wrong thing for too long. "I'm sorry, Brandon," he said. "I should have said no 3 years ago." "You're sorry." Brandon's voice broke on the second word, cracked clean through all the smoothness gone. "You're sorry. You come in here and hand over 2 years of you hand them everything, and you tell me you're sorry." "I told you in March that I wanted out," Victor said. "I told you the Pelican Bay deal was too exposed. You told me Natalie had signed off and there was nothing to worry about." His voice hardened slightly. "You used her name to keep me in. You used a lot of names that weren't yours to use." George had moved to stand beside me, and I could feel the quiet fury radiating off him, the particular outrage of a man of 70 watching something he spent decades building be treated as a tool. His hand found my arm and gripped it. "Ed," he said very quietly, and the way he said my name had 40 years of friendship in it, every deal we had shaken hands on. Every winter we had argued over projections, every summer we had sat on the Fisher Island dock with bourbon and said less than we needed to. I know, I said. Natalie had moved from the edge of the room. I heard her before I saw her, heard her heels on the marble, heard her breathing sharp and uneven. She appeared at Daniel's side, her eyes swollen, her mascara ruined, her hands pressed flat against her stomach, like a woman bracing for an impact that had already arrived. She looked at Victor. How much did he know you were involved? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady in the way that things are steady when the person speaking them is running entirely on the last reserves of something. How much of what he told me about the company, about the deals, was real? Victor looked at her, and the tiredness in his face deepened into something that might have been shame. Mrs. Sinclair, answer me. Her voice cracked on the last word, and her eyes went bright and wet, and she pressed her hands harder against her stomach and lifted her chin. Please, just answer me. Victor exhaled slowly. The Pelican Bay deal was the only one that directly used your signature, he said. But the others, the Delaware LLCs, the Cayman transfers, those were built on Hargrove Capital's reputation, your family's reputation. Every time Brandon walked into a room with the Hargrove name behind him, that was part of it. Natalie closed her eyes. One tear escaped down the left side of her face, and she did not wipe it. Her whole body shuddered once, a single involuntary tremor, and then she opened her eyes and looked at her father. I was already looking at her. Dad, she said, and her voice broke completely on that. Word broke and kept breaking, and she took 3 steps and walked into my arms, and I caught her and held on hard, my chin against the top of her head, my eyes burning, my chest aching with a pain that was not the bruise on my cheek, but something older and deeper and almost unbearable. I've got you, I said into her hair. I've got you, Natalie, I've got you. She cried, not prettily, not quietly. She cried the way people cry when they have been holding something back for years, and the last wall finally comes down with her whole body, with gasping and shaking, and both hands fisting in the lapels of my jacket. Daniel stepped in from the side and put his arm around her shoulders, and the 3 of us stood there in the middle of the ballroom floor while the night rebuilt itself around us. Behind us, I heard Frank speaking quietly to Diana. I heard the sound of Brandon's footsteps moving toward the exit. I did not watch him go. George had found us a corner, a quiet alcove near the east wall of the ballroom, where the noise of the room was still present but muffled like music heard through water. He had pulled 3 chairs into a loose cluster and disappeared, returning minutes later with a glass of water for Natalie and a bourbon for me that I did not ask for and was deeply grateful for. Natalie sat with both hands wrapped around the water glass, her fingers white at the knuckles. She had stopped crying, but the evidence of it was everywhere. The red rims of her eyes, the mascara she had wiped imperfectly at her cheeks, the slight tremor in her lower lip that she kept pressing flat with her teeth. She was 37 years old, and in that moment she looked both younger and older than that younger in her devastation. Older in the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a wrong thing for a very long time. Daniel was in the chair beside her, his elbows on his knees, leaning forward, not crowding her, just close enough to catch her if she needed catching. I took a sip of the bourbon and waited. I need to say it out loud, Natalie said. Her voice was steadier than I expected. Raw but steady, the voice of a woman who had decided that the only way through was straight through. All of it. I need to say it to you, Dad, and to Daniel. She glanced at her brother, and something passed between them, a long, complicated look that held 3 years of distance and the first tentative steps back across it. I need you both to hear it from me, not from Victor, not from Agent Morse, from me. We're listening, Daniel said. Natalie took a breath. I knew about the Pelican Bay deal, she said. Brandon told me 2 weeks ago that he was working on a significant transaction involving a trust-held parcel. He described it as a routine monetization, his exact words. He said the trust had been dormant on that asset for years, and that converting it to liquid capital was the sensible financial move. She paused, her jaw tightened. I asked him if you knew Dad. He told me you had been consulted and that you had reservations, but had ultimately deferred to his judgment as acting CEO. The bourbon turned sharp in my throat. He told you I deferred to him. Yes. Her eyes met mine, and the pain in them was so direct and unguarded that it hit me like something physical, right in the sternum, right where the ribs come together. And I believed him. Because I had spent 4 years watching him make decisions that worked out, and I had spent 4 years being told that you and Daniel were resistant to change, that you were holding the company back out of sentiment, and Her voice fractured. She pressed her lips together hard. I believed him, Dad. I chose to believe him. Natalie, I started. Let me finish. She pressed on, and there was something fierce and determined in her, now a woman refusing to be gentle with herself, refusing the easy exits. The documents? He put them in front of me on a Wednesday night. We had just come back from dinner at the Brickell place, you know, the Italian restaurant Brandon likes. He had a bottle of wine on the table when we got home. He said there was paperwork that needed to go out by end-of-week compliance filings, nothing significant. Her hands tightened on the water glass until I could see the tendons in her wrists. I was tired. I had been tired for months, and I trusted him. And I signed. The room seemed to contract around those 2 words. I signed. Daniel made a sound not quite a word, just a short compressed sound of pain, and reached over and put his hand over Natalie's on the water glass. His jaw was working. His eyes were bright and fierce and full of everything he was choosing not to say about Brandon Sinclair in this moment. How many documents? I asked. My voice came out quieter than I intended. 6 pages. Natalie's voice dropped. I initialed 5 of them. The 6th he flipped to it, quickly pointed to the signature line, and She stopped. Her breath caught audibly. I didn't read it. I signed where he pointed and I didn't read it. And that document, I said carefully, is what Sophia flagged, the beneficial interest transfer. Natalie nodded. One tear escaped down her right cheek, and she caught it with the back of her hand with a quick, almost angry motion. What does it mean for the trust? For what does it actually mean, Dad? It means nothing, I said. It's void. Frank confirmed it tonight. You are a beneficiary, not a trustee. A beneficiary cannot authorize a distribution or a transfer of trust assets. The document Brandon had you sign has no legal weight. Something moved through Natalie's face, relief so acute it looked almost like pain, the specific relief of a person who has been bracing for a blow that lands softer than expected. A sob came out of her that she hadn't anticipated, a short, broken sound, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and shook her head as if scolding herself for it. Don't do that, Daniel said, squeezing her hand. Don't apologize for crying. You have Natalie, you have every right. I should have known, she said, muffled behind her palm. He's a professional, Daniel said, and there was a controlled, careful fury in his voice that he was keeping measured for her benefit. He has been doing this for years, to people far more cynical than you. The alcove curtain shifted, and a woman stepped through early 40s dark curly hair, a burgundy dress eyes that moved immediately to Natalie with the focused attention of someone who had been looking for her for some time. Her expression when she saw Natalie's face was a complicated cocktail of relief and heartbreak. Nat, her voice was warm and tight at the same time. Oh, honey. Natalie's head came up. Caroline. The word came out half relief, half fresh grief. You came. Of course I came. Caroline Hughes crossed the small space in 4 steps and crouched in front of Natalie's chair, taking both of Natalie's hands in hers, her eyes scanning her friend's face with the particular attention of someone who was both a friend and I knew something more. I've been in this building since 9 o'clock. Frank called me this afternoon. Natalie looked up at me with wide, startled eyes. Frank called her. Frank thinks of everything, I said. Caroline looked at me over Natalie's shoulder. Mr. Hargrove. Her voice was direct and clear. I've been Natalie's therapist for 2 years. I also have a documented professional assessment of Brandon Sinclair's behavioral patterns, compiled over 18 months of working with Natalie and observing the dynamics she described. She paused. I've already shared a copy with Agent Morse, with Natalie's prior consent. Natalie blinked. I signed that release 6 months ago, she said slowly, as if the pieces were assembling themselves in real time. You told me it was standard, Caroline said gently. And it was also something Frank asked me to have ready if it came to this. She squeezed Natalie's hands once. You weren't alone in this, Nat. You were never alone. There were people watching out for you the whole time. Natalie looked at her father. I looked back at my daughter. And for the first time all night, something in her eyes shifted. The devastation still there, the pain still real, but underneath it, something else beginning to surface. Something that looked tentatively and carefully, like the first light of a morning after a very long night. The balcony off the east wing of the Fontainebleau ran the full length of the second floor, and at this hour it was mostly empty. A few couples at the far end, the warm Miami night pressing in from all sides, thick with salt, and the distant pulse of music from the hotel's lower bar. The Atlantic was out there in the dark, massive and patient, its surface catching the light of a half-moon in long silver strips. George found me leaning against the railing, with my second bourbon staring at nothing in particular and thinking about everything. "You should eat something," he said, coming to stand beside me. He had a plate from the dinner service in one hand, bread rolls and something that might have been salmon, and he set it on the railing in front of me, with the matter-of-fact authority of a man who has been feeding people through crises for 70 years. "You've had 2 bourbons and a cheekbone injury, and you haven't eaten since God knows when." "I'm not hungry, George." "I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said you should eat." He broke off a piece of bread roll and handed it to me directly the way you hand bread to a child. "Eat." I ate. It was against all reason the best thing I had tasted all evening. George rested his forearms on the railing and looked out at the water. He was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, but the kind that belongs between 2 men who have been friends long enough that silence is just another form of conversation. "I've known you for 41 years, George said finally. "I was there when you signed the first Hargrove Capital deal on a cocktail napkin in a bar on Brickell Avenue. I was in the waiting room when Natalie was born. I carried Maggie's casket." His voice was even steady, the voice of a man reporting the facts of his life clearly and without flinching. "In 41 years, Ed, I have never seen you plan anything the way you planned tonight." "I had good help," I said. "You had Frank and Sophia and a federal agent," George said. "But the architecture of it, the timing, the sequence, the way you let Brandon do every single thing you needed him to do, that was you." He paused. "When did you know about all of it? When did you actually know?" I turned the bourbon glass slowly in my hands. The condensation was cold against my palm, the night air warm against the back of my neck. 2 weeks ago, I said. I drove out to Fisher Island on a Thursday morning early before Natalie was up. I went to look at the old filing cabinet in the study, the one Maggie used to keep her property records in. I stopped. The memory had an edge to it that hadn't dulled. The Pelican Bay deed was gone, just gone. The folder was there, the label was there, but the deed itself had been removed. My jaw tightened. I called Frank from the driveway. And Frank had already been watching. Frank had been watching for 18 months, I said. He told me on the phone that day that Diana's team had been building the case and that they were within weeks of having everything they needed. He asked me to wait, to not confront Brandon directly, to let the investigation run its course. I took a sip of the bourbon. I told him I would wait, but I also told him I needed one thing. George turned his head toward me. "Senator Caldwell." "Robert and I go back 20 years, I said. "He was the guest of honor at 3 Hargrove Capital fundraising events. He knows this company, he knows my name, and he knows what my reputation in this city is worth." I set the glass down on the railing. I called him on a Friday morning, and I told him I needed a favor. I told him there was going to be an event at the Fontainebleau on Father's Day, and that I needed him in the room. That was all I told him. And he came. "He came," I said, "because Robert Caldwell is a man who understands that sometimes the most important thing a person of standing can do is simply be present." I looked out at the water. Brandon needed a room full of important people to make his announcement feel legitimate. I needed the same room with the same people to make what came after feel undeniable. George was quiet for a moment. Then he let out a long breath that was half laugh, half something more complicated. His eyes were bright under the balcony lights, and he shook his head slowly. "Maggie would have loved this," he said, and his voice caught just slightly on her name. "She always said you were the most patient man she had ever met, that you never moved until you were completely certain." My chest ached. It was a good ache, the kind that means something was real and mattered and still matters. "She also said my timing was terrible," I said. George laughed a real laugh, genuine and full, the laugh of a man releasing something that had been compressed for hours. "She was right about that, too." The balcony door opened behind us, and Senator Caldwell stepped through. He was still impeccable, the suit unrumpled, the silver hair in place, but his expression when he came to stand at the railing was different from the senator's expression he wore in the ballroom. Quieter, more personal. "Ed." He rested his hands on the railing beside mine. "I think I deserve an explanation." "You deserve several," I said. "I'm sorry I couldn't give them to you in advance." "You asked me to be a witness," he said. "You didn't tell me I was going to be a witness to a federal investigation." His tone was not angry. It was the measured voice of a man establishing facts before deciding how he feels about them. "If I had told you," I said carefully, "it would have put you in a position of prior knowledge that might have complicated your standing as an independent witness. I needed you credible, Robert, not complicit." Senator Caldwell looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded a single slow nod, the nod of a man who has considered an argument and found it reluctantly sound. "You protected my position by keeping me uninformed." "I did," I said, "and I owe you an apology for it." "You owe me a dinner," he said, somewhere considerably less eventful than this. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the first movement toward one. "For what it's worth, Ed, what I witnessed tonight will be very clearly recorded in my statement to Agent Morse. The assault, the service of documents, the conduct of Brandon Sinclair in the presence of federal law enforcement." He paused. "And the conduct of your family, which was," he seemed to choose the word carefully, "dignified." My throat tightened. "Thank you, Robert." The balcony door opened again, and Frank stepped through his briefcase still in hand, his reading glasses finally down from his forehead and onto his face where they belonged. He looked at the three of us at the railing and allowed himself the briefest possible expression of satisfaction before it disappeared back into the lawyer's face. "Gentlemen," he said, "there's something inside I think you should all hear." The room Frank led us to was a small conference suite off the East Corridor, the kind of room hotels keep for private business meetings, with a long oval table, 8 leather chairs, and recessed lighting that someone had dimmed to a level that felt almost respectful. A carafe of water sat in the center of the table. Nobody touched it. We arranged ourselves without ceremony. Ed at the far end, Daniel and Natalie side by side to his left, George beside Senator Caldwell on the right, Caroline in the chair nearest the door. Frank stood at the head of the table, his briefcase open in front of him, and for a moment he simply looked at us, all of us, the way a man looks at a room before he says something he has been carrying for a very long time. "Before I begin," Frank said, "I want to say one thing that is not legal in nature and not part of the evidentiary record." He took off his reading glasses and held them in both hands. His voice, when it came, was quieter than his lawyer's voice, quieter and rougher, and entirely his own. "I have been sitting on what I am about to share for 4 years. I made a judgment call in 2020 that I have questioned every single day since. I decided that what Maggie left behind was not yet that the time was not right." He stopped, his jaw tightened briefly. "I was wrong to wait as long as I did. And I am sorry, Ed. I am deeply sorry." My throat closed. I pressed my hands flat on the table and nodded once because that was all I could manage. Frank reached into the briefcase and removed a white envelope, standard letter size, slightly yellowed at the edges, sealed with tape that had been carefully re-adhered after opening. My name was written on the front in Maggie's handwriting. The room seemed to contract. Natalie made a sound soft, involuntary, like someone who has just stepped on a piece of glass in the dark. Her hand found Daniel's on the table and gripped it. Daniel turned his palm over immediately and held on his jaw, set his eyes very bright. "Maggie wrote this letter in February of 2020. Frank said, setting the envelope gently on the table in front of me. 4 months before she passed, she gave it to me personally in this building during what we told everyone was a routine estate planning session." He paused. "She asked me to keep it until there was a reason to use it. She said I would know when." I looked at the envelope, at my name in her handwriting, the slightly forward slant she always had, the way she wrote the capital E, with a small flourish at the top that she claimed was an accident and I claimed was vanity and she always laughed about. "Will you read it aloud?" I asked Frank. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'm not sure I can read it myself right now." Frank nodded. He unfolded the letter carefully, the paper making the soft sound of something long preserved, and he cleared his throat once. "Dear Edward," he read, "if Frank has given you this, then something has happened that I was afraid might happen. I want you to know first that I am not writing this from a place of fear or bitterness. I am writing it because I love our family more than I have ever been able to say properly, and I need to say something that I didn't know how to say to your face." Natalie's breath came in ragged and uneven. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and closed her eyes. Frank continued, "I have watched Natalie with Brandon for 8 months now. I have watched the way she changes when he is in the room, the way she makes herself smaller, the way she checks his expression. Before she finishes a sentence, the way she laughed less between October and December than she laughed in any single month of the 33 years I was her mother. I do not have proof of anything. I have a mother's eyes, which are a different kind of proof entirely." Daniel made a sound, the compressed, controlled sound of a man absorbing a blow. His hand tightened around Natalie's until her knuckles went white. She didn't pull away. She held on harder. "I am asking you, Edward, to watch. I am asking you not to interfere too soon, because Natalie is proud, and she will defend him if she feels cornered, and that will only drive her further away. I am asking you to watch and to wait and to be ready. And I am asking you specifically not to trust the man she has brought into this family with anything that cannot be taken back. Not the company, not the land, not the name." Frank's voice, which had been steady and professional through every word, wavered slightly on the last sentence. He stopped for exactly 1 second, then pressed on. "You have always been more patient than me, Ed. Use it, and when the time comes, and I believe it will come, make sure the children are beside you, both of them. They are going to need each other more than they know. All my love always, Maggie." The room was so still I could hear the air conditioning and faintly the music from the hotel bar below us. Natalie was crying, without sound, tears running steadily down her face, her whole body shaking with the effort of containing something too large to contain. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side, and she turned her face into his shoulder and wept, and he pressed his cheek against the top of her head and closed his eyes and held her with the fierce, unguarded tenderness of a brother who had been waiting years for the chance. George Patterson, 70 years old, and not a man given to public display, was wiping his eyes with the back of his hand and making no effort to pretend he wasn't. Senator Caldwell had both hands flat on the table, his head slightly bowed, the composed public face gone entirely. I sat very still with my hands in front of me and let Maggie's words move through me, the way light moves through water, slowly changing direction, reaching places that had been dark for a long time. My eyes were burning. My chest was full of something that had no clean name: grief and gratitude and love, and the particular ache of being known completely by someone who was no longer here to be thanked for it. "She knew," Natalie said finally, her voice muffled against Daniel's shoulder, broken and tender and full of wonder. "She knew the whole time. She was your mother," I said. My voice was not entirely steady, and I did not try to make it so. "She knew everything. She always knew everything." Frank refolded the letter with great care and placed it back in the envelope. "This letter," he said, returning to his lawyer's voice because it was the only voice he had left that was still standing, "has been logged as Exhibit G in the civil proceedings. Its content is relevant to the question of Ed's intent in establishing the trust protections and to the pattern of behavior that Sophia and Diana's teams have documented." He paused. "Maggie's words are now part of the legal record." I pressed my fingers against my eyes for a moment. When I brought them down, the room was still there, and my family was still in it, and that was enough. "What's next?" I asked. Frank put his glasses back on. "Caroline," he said. Caroline Hughes opened the slim, black binder on the table in front of her, with the careful, deliberate movements of a woman who understood that what she was about to present would change the way everyone in this room understood the last 4 years. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were clear. But when she looked at Natalie before she began, there was something in her expression that was purely human and purely personal, the look of a woman who had spent 2 years watching her friend be diminished and had been waiting with immense patience and considerable pain for this exact moment. "I want to be clear about what this is and what it isn't," Caroline said, her voice even and professional. "I am a licensed clinical psychologist with a specialization in coercive control dynamics. I am not Brandon Sinclair's therapist. I have never treated him, and nothing in this report constitutes a clinical diagnosis. What this is," she tapped the binder, "is a behavioral pattern analysis compiled over 22 months based on Natalie's detailed accounts of interactions, incidents, and communications, cross-referenced with established clinical literature on coercive control and financial abuse." Diana Morse, sitting to Caroline's left, had her own copy of the binder open. She turned a page without looking up. The document has been logged as Exhibit H, she said simply. Oh. 22 months. Daniel said, his voice low. He was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, his eyes moving between Caroline and the binder. You've been building this for nearly 2 years, Caroline. 22 months and 4 days, Caroline said. She looked at Natalie directly. Do you remember the session in August of 2022? The one where you came in and told me that Brandon had gone through your phone while you were asleep and deleted 3 of my contact entries. Natalie's lips pressed together. Her eyes were still red, but she had composed herself into something harder and more focused during the brief time since the letter, the composure of a woman who had been cracked open and was now carefully beginning to reassemble. I remember, she said. I told you it was a misunderstanding, that he was protective. I know what you told me, Caroline said not unkindly. And I know why you told me that, but that was the session where I opened this file. She touched the binder. Because what you described was not protectiveness. It was the 3rd incident of communication isolation in 6 months, and isolation is always the first wall. What else is in there? Ed asked. His voice was controlled, but his hands flat on the table had tightened not visibly to everyone, but enough that I felt it in my own knuckles. Caroline turned to the first tabbed section. I've organized it into 4 categories, she said. Isolation, financial control, identity erosion, and escalation. She looked up. I'll go through each one briefly, but I want Natalie to stop me at any point if something is inaccurate or if she wants to add context. This is her story. I'm only the person who wrote it down. Natalie nodded. Her chin was up. Her eyes were fierce and wet and absolutely determined. Isolation, Caroline said. Over the course of the marriage, Natalie's contact with her father decreased from approximately weekly calls and monthly in-person visits to quarterly calls and 3 in-person meetings in the last 18 months. Her contact with Daniel was effectively severed within the first year. She paused and looked at Daniel. That was not accidental, and it was not Natalie's choice. Brandon systematically reframed both relationships, Ed, as resistant to progress, Daniel as resentful and difficult, until Natalie began to self-isolate from the people most likely to notice what was happening. Daniel's jaw worked. His eyes went bright and fierce, and he pressed his lips flat and looked at his sister. Natalie, he said, his voice rough and low. I need you to know that not once, I never thought you chose him over us. I want you to hear that. Natalie's composure cracked for just a moment, a single sharp intake of breath, her eyes flooding. She pressed her fingers hard against the bridge of her nose and pulled herself back. Keep going, she said to Caroline. Please. Financial control, Caroline said. Natalie described a gradual transfer of financial autonomy over the first 18 months, beginning with Brandon taking over the management of her personal accounts, for efficiency progressing to Natalie having limited access to liquid funds without Brandon's approval. She described asking for money for a birthday gift for Ed in April 2023, and Brandon reviewing and approving the amount. Caroline's voice remained clinical, but something in the set of her shoulders was fierce. That is not a partnership. That is a structure of dependence designed to ensure compliance. Natalie let out a breath through her nose, short, and controlled the breath of a woman who was hearing things she already knew, but had never heard named so clearly. Her eyes were burning. She did not look away. Identity erosion, Caroline said. The most insidious and the hardest to document. Over 22 months, the Natalie who described her life to me in sessions became progressively smaller. Fewer opinions volunteered, fewer preferences stated, more deference to Brandon's framing of events. In our first session, she described herself as, and I'm quoting her directly from my notes, a person who used to know exactly what she wanted. By month 14, she described herself as someone who finds it easier not to want things. Caroline stopped. Her voice for the first time was not entirely steady. She was 35 years old. The room received that in full. Natalie was crying again, not the broken sobbing from earlier, but something quieter and more complicated, tears running steadily while her face stayed composed. The crying of a woman who has finally been given the exact words for something she has been trying to describe in the dark for years. Caroline, Natalie's voice was barely above a whisper. Why didn't you push harder earlier? Caroline looked at her friend. Her eyes were bright and full. Because you weren't ready, she said gently. And because pushing someone toward a truth they aren't ready for doesn't free them. It just makes them defend the cage. She reached across the table and put her hand over Natalie's. You had to find your way to the door yourself. I just made sure the door was there when you did. Diana turned to the final section of the binder. The escalation documentation, she said to the room, will be incorporated into the federal case file. Combined with Victor Hale's communications and Sophia Reeves's financial analysis, it establishes a pattern of predatory behavior with sufficient consistency to support the fraud and coercive control elements of the prosecution. She looked at Natalie with the direct, unsparing eyes of a woman who spent her life looking at damage and measuring it clearly. Mrs. Sinclair, Diana said, what was done to your family was deliberate, methodical, and calculated over a period of years. You were not naive. You were targeted. Natalie pressed both hands flat on the table. Her back was straight. Her eyes were clear. And for the first time since I had watched her stand in the ballroom, with her hands over her mouth and her world coming apart, she looked like herself, like the daughter I had raised, like the woman Maggie had known would find her way back. What do I need to sign? Natalie said. Frank placed 3 documents on the table, not 6-3. 1 page each, clean and unambiguous, the kind of paperwork that says exactly what it means and means exactly what it says. The first document, Frank said, tapping the top page, is a formal revocation of all signatory authority previously granted to Brandon Sinclair over Hargrove Capital accounts and trust-affiliated assets. The second is a revocation of the limited power of attorney that Brandon claimed in the Delaware LLC filings, which I should note was never properly executed, but we are revoking it formally, regardless, to eliminate any argument of apparent authority. He looked at Natalie steadily. The third is a written statement of your account of events, the signing under duress, the timeline, the context. It will accompany Diana's case file. Natalie looked at the 3 pages. Her hands were on the table, both of them pressed flat, and they were not shaking. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were dry and clear and fixed on the documents with the concentration of a woman who was going to read every single word before she touched a pen. Give me a moment, she said. Take all the time you need, Frank said. She read. The room waited, not impatiently, not anxiously, but with the particular quality of patience that comes when everyone present understands that something important is happening, and rushing, it would be a desecration. Caroline sat with her hands folded. Diana reviewed her own notes. George had both hands wrapped around a glass of water, watching Natalie with an expression of quiet, ferocious pride. Daniel was watching his sister with something in his face that I had not seen there in years, open and unguarded, stripped of the careful distance he had been maintaining since Maggie's funeral, since the company disputes, since all the long months of hurt that had calcified between them. His eyes were bright and a little desperate, the eyes of a man who wants very badly to say something, and is not sure yet if this is the right moment. Natalie finished the 3rd page. She set it down. She picked up the pen Frank had placed beside the documents. Then she stopped. She looked up at Daniel. I need to say something first, she said. Her voice was not quite steady, but it was deliberate, a woman choosing every word with care. To you, before I sign anything. She set the pen down and turned her body to face him fully, and her eyes filled immediately, which seemed to frustrate her, because she pressed her lips together hard and breathed through it. I let him take you from me. I know that's what happened. Now I can hear it in what Caroline documented. I can see it in the timeline, but knowing the mechanism doesn't change the fact that I let it happen. I let 3 years go by, Daniel. 3 years of your calls going unanswered and your messages going short, and I told myself you were being difficult, and he was right about you, and I... Her voice broke clean through. She pressed her knuckles against her mouth for 1 second, then pulled them down. I am so sorry. I am so deeply, genuinely sorry. Daniel's composure lasted approximately 4 more seconds. Then it didn't. He made a sound that was not quite a word, something wrecked and relieved and full of 3 years of missing his sister, and he reached across the corner of the table and pulled her into his arms, his chair scraping back with the force of the movement, and Natalie went into the embrace with a sound like something finally released, a sob that had been building for years, full-throated and shaking her fingers, gripping the back of his jacket. Don't, Daniel said, his voice rough against the top of her head, cracking at the edges. Don't apologize anymore. It's done. You're here. We're here. He held her hard, both arms, his eyes pressed shut, his jaw working against the effort of keeping himself contained. I'm not losing you again. Do you hear me? I'm not losing you again. I pressed my hand flat on the table and looked at the ceiling and breathed. George cleared his throat loudly, which was his version of crying. When Natalie pulled back from Daniel, her face was wrecked and luminous. The face of someone who has just set down a weight they had stopped noticing because they had been carrying it so long. She picked up the pen without hesitation and signed all 3 documents, each signature clean and certain, and nothing like the exhausted scrawl of a woman signing papers at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night. "George," Frank said when the documents were signed and countersigned and Diana had taken her copies, "I believe you had something to add." George set down his water glass and straightened in his chair with the air of a man who has been waiting patiently for his cue. "I do," he said. He reached into his jacket, the inner breast pocket, the one he always kept buttoned, and produced a single folded page. He smoothed it on the table in front of him. "I am the co-founding shareholder of Hargrove Capital. I hold 5% of the original equity which has never been sold, transferred, or diluted. 5% does not sound like much." His voice was calm and a little dry, the voice of a man who has been underestimated for 7 decades and has long since made his peace with it. "But under the original shareholder agreement, which Ed and I drafted on a cocktail napkin in 1983 and later formalized by a very irritated paralegal, any major asset disposition requires approval from shareholders representing no less than 75% of original equity." Diana looked up from her notes. "Anne Brandon's transaction was approved by 68%, George said simply, "because he forgot I existed." He unfolded the page, a single formal letter pre-drafted. "I am filing a formal shareholder objection to the Pelican Bay transaction, effective tonight." He looked at Brandon's empty chair. "He forgot I existed," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that was almost gentle, the way a teacher is gentle when a student has made a very instructive mistake. He always did. The room exhaled. Frank took George's letter examined. It nodded once and added it to his briefcase with the careful satisfaction of a man completing a structure he has been building for a very long time. "Is there anything else?" Daniel asked, looking around the table. I looked at Frank. Frank looked at me. Something passed between us, 45 years of friendship, compressed into a single exchange glance, and he gave me a small nod. "One more thing," I said, "but not tonight." The morning after Father's Day came in through the Fisher Island windows, like it always did, slowly, and golden, the bay flat as hammered copper, the palms barely moving in the early air. I had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, not from pain, though my cheek had bruised overnight into something that would have alarmed a stranger. I had been awake because the house was quiet, in a way it had not been quiet in years, and I had wanted to sit in it and feel it properly before the day began. Natalie was asleep in the guest room. Daniel was on the sofa in the study with his jacket folded under his head, his laptop open on the coffee table, the trust documents still pulled up on the screen. He had fallen asleep working. I made coffee. I carried 2 cups to the dock and sat in the old wooden chair that had been there since Maggie bought it at an estate sale in 2004, and that I had never replaced because replacing it had never felt necessary. The bay moved slowly beneath the dock. A pelican landed on the piling at the far end and regarded me with the solemn indifference of a creature that had seen considerably more of the world than it intended to discuss. Sophia arrived at 8:30, the way Sophia always arrived, precisely when she said she would, with a leather portfolio under her arm, and the expression of a woman who had slept 4 hours and considered that adequate. "You look terrible," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "Thank you, Sophia. The cheek is worse this morning." "I'm aware. Diana's team wants a photograph for the file before it fades." She opened the portfolio. "I can arrange that this afternoon if you're willing." "I'm willing." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. "Tell me about the trust." Sophia turned to the second page of the portfolio. 14 months ago, she said, when I first identified the pattern of transactions Brandon was routing through the Delaware LLCs, I brought it to Frank. Frank brought it to Diana. And the 3 of us, without telling you which I want to acknowledge directly and for which I owe you an explanation, began a quiet restructuring of the Hargrove family trust. She looked at me steadily. We added 2 protective provisions. The first is the Section 22 freeze clause, which you know about. The second, she turned another page, is a provision that designates all trust assets as exempt from third-party debt instruments, including mortgage agreements, collateralization arrangements, or security interests entered into by any party other than the named trustee. I set my coffee down. The Cayman mortgage. Yes. Sophia's voice was even, but her eyes were fierce. Approximately 16 months ago, Brandon entered into a collateralization agreement with a private financial institution registered in the Cayman Islands. He pledged Hargrove Capital assets, including 4 commercial properties and a portion of the investment portfolio, as security against a personal debt of approximately $7.2 million. She let that number sit for a moment. The provision we added to the trust 14 months ago renders that agreement void as applied to any trust-held asset. The Cayman institution has no enforceable claim. The morning light moved across the kitchen table, and I let myself feel the full weight of what Sophia had just said. $7.2 million. Brandon had not just been using the company, he had been drowning in debt and using the company as a life raft, and the life raft had been quietly, methodically waterproofed 14 months ago by a woman sitting at my kitchen table drinking my coffee. "You should have told me," I said. "Yes," Sophia said, without deflection or excuse. "I should have. Frank and I made the same judgment call that telling you before we had the full picture would have caused you to move too soon and potentially compromise the investigation." She paused. "We were protecting you by keeping you uninformed, which is exactly what you did with Senator Caldwell." She looked at me. "I believe the technical term is irony." I laughed. It came out of me unexpectedly, a real laugh, short and genuine, the kind that surprises you with its own existence. Sophia's mouth curved very slightly, which for Sophia was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Is the trust secure?" I asked. "Completely. No remaining exposure." "The trust is secure," Sophia said. "The Cayman claim is void. The Pelican Bay parcel is frozen and protected. The Delaware LLCs are being unwound by Diana's team. Brandon Sinclair has no remaining legal access to a single Hargrove asset." She closed the portfolio with a clean final snap. "It's done, Ed." I heard footsteps on the stairs, 2 sets close together. Daniel appeared first, his hair disheveled, his jacket still in his hand. Natalie was just behind him in one of Maggie's old cardigans that she must have found in the guest room closet. Her hair pulled back her face, clear and tired, and more herself than I had seen her in 4 years. "Is there coffee?" Daniel asked. "There is," I said. He poured 2 cups, handed one to Natalie, and they both sat at the table with the unstudied ease of people who have remembered how to be in the same room together. It was, I thought, the best thing I had seen in years. 6 weeks later, a Tuesday morning in August, the bay glittering outside, the summer easing toward its end, Natalie sat in that same chair at the kitchen table with her own coffee. Her divorce filing completed and submitted. Her name restored, her role at Hargrove Capital officially reinstated by the board. "Dad," she said. She had been looking at the bay, and now she turned to me with the direct, clear eyes of a woman who had done a great deal of difficult thinking and arrived somewhere solid. "When did you actually know about Brandon? The real answer, not the deed, not the paperwork. When did you know in your gut that something was wrong?" I turned my coffee cup slowly in my hands. Outside, a boat moved across the bay, its wake spreading outward in long, even arcs. "The night he asked me for your hand," I said. Natalie went very still. "He sat across from me at this table," I said. "Right there where you're sitting. And he told me he loved you, and I believed him. I still believe he believed it in whatever way he was capable of believing it. But then he spent 40 minutes talking about the company." I looked at her steadily. "Not about you, about the company, about the direction he thought it should take, the decisions he thought were being made wrong, the potential he thought was being squandered." I paused. A man who is sitting across from a woman's father, asking for her hand, should not be able to stop talking about her business holdings for 40 minutes. Natalie's eyes had filled. She pressed them with 2 fingers and breathed. "Why did you say yes?" she whispered. "Because you loved him," I said simply. "And because I hoped I was wrong." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "I have spent 4 years hoping I was wrong, Natalie. Please understand that." She turned her hand over and held mine hard. "You weren't wrong," she said. "No," I said, "but I had the right daughter. And in the end, that was enough." The bay moved outside, the window patient and enormous and full of light, and the 2 of us sat together in the morning, quiet, a father and his daughter on the other side of the hardest year either of us had ever lived, drinking coffee while the summer burned beautifully around us. They say God gives you the family you're born into and the wisdom to protect it, but only if you're willing to pay attention long enough to understand what protection actually means. I paid attention, I just paid it slowly. This is a family story about what happens when trust is weaponized by someone who was never interested in belonging, only in taking. If you see yourself somewhere in this story, I want to say something directly to you. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until the deed is missing from the folder. Don't swallow the discomfort at the dinner table and call it patience. Real patience is not the same as looking away, and I confused the two for far too long. My personal belief is simple. The people who love you will always leave evidence of that love. And the people who don't, they leave a different kind of evidence entirely. Learn to read both. This has been a family story of loss of silence that cost too much, and of a morning on a dock in Miami when I finally understood that protecting your family sometimes means being willing to burn down everything a dishonest man built inside it. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly over years in small surrenders you barely notice until they're gone. If this family story moved you, if any part of it felt true, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and if you haven't already subscribed to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Family betrayal leaves marks, but so does the decision to finally stand up. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the very end. This is Revenge Dad, and I'll see you in the next story. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted for educational purposes. If that's not the content you're looking for, no hard feelings, step away and find what speaks to you. But if you're staying, buckle up.
Welcome to the Story Channel. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few notes. The content in this video uses AI-generated images and voice narration, combined with the channel's creative editing. Everything is intended solely for entertainment purposes and does not depict or reflect any real events or real people. Hope you enjoy the story and have a great time watching.